The demand on the national grid from EVs is growing and set to grow even faster in the future as EVs become much more common. Our government dictates that many more EV public chargers are needed to be installed, but seem to have done nothing to make sure they get connected as fast as they are installed. Well, then in September 2023, the already privatised national grid was sold off to the Macquarie Global Finance Services Group. Now, if the UK water companies are anything to go by, the situation is likely to get far worse as the national grid is likely to be asset stripped and investment strictly limited to whatever takes the least cost and effort and also makes a very quick buck. EV public chargers could end up struggling to get connected and struggling even more to collect any money, let alone make a profit. Yet there are several really quick and easy answers that are, well, they'll make a huge difference. Why doesn't the government use grown-ups to make their policies? I'm Dave, this is Dave Takes It On. And here we have a look at self-powered public EV megachargers that charge less per kilowatt, reduce or eliminate the load on the grid, and make record profits for the CPOs. And they're not likely to be adopted by investment funds and private equity investors anytime soon. Now, we regularly film charger locations where, even after a year, although fully installed, they're not yet operational, and the primary cause is the final grid connection by the DNO, distribution network operator. And when connected, they always add an additional load onto the grid. Now, with most installations being multiple chargers above 300 kilowatts, the connections required are also getting much bigger, involving substantial substation upgrades, and as a result, they're a lot dearer. Well, in the UK, we produce or import more electricity than we use pretty much around the clock, and the price we pay varies. Economy 7 and EV special tariffs, those rates are kept really low overnight to encourage us to use electricity that otherwise would just go to waste. Price varies according to supply and demand. On occasions, we produce so much that generators can be turned off. Alternating current, that cannot be stored. On a nice windy summer's day with clear blue skies, the generators that are turned off tend to be the renewables, the solar and the wind farms. The out-of-date logical reasons for this are purely to suit the grid, not the users, us. Our biggest problem in the UK is seasonal supply and demand. A domestic solar panel system can produce electricity more than we need over a full year, but most is in the summer when we don't need it, and very little in the winter when we need far more. Many domestic PV systems now include batteries to try to balance this out, but they're very limited. You cannot store enough in the summer to get you through the winter. What home battery packs can do is to store some excess during the day, completely free of charge, to then use at night, but not that much. So home batteries are now being used in a different way, offering even more savings, and sometimes they do not even use solar PV panels at all. If economy 7 or EV tariff rates overnight are around 6 or 7p, then simply charge your battery up overnight on the grid and then use the stored electricity during the day when the normal rates are around about 25p. With a sufficient sized battery, you can run your whole house like this on off-peak electricity all year round. Charge up at night, use it during the day. That's quarter price. And all you need is a battery. So it's ideal for those who cannot have solar panels, like those who live in a flat and have no roof. In addition to saving money, you'd actually also be helping the grid because you'll not be drawing any electricity at peak times when the grid struggles to keep up with demand. It's a win-win. Well, if you up the scale and do the same with public EV chargers, we're talking here about megapacks. Very large grid-connected batteries which charge up overnight at cheap rates and then run the EV charger for the whole day. You can then sell the electricity you bought really cheap at a nice profit. With a sufficient sized battery, you need never pay full rate for your electricity, But even if the battery is smaller, you can still do a very short sort of boost top up during the day if and when it was needed. See, many people already do this with Economy 7. They get a special cheap boost rate for just an hour or so sometime during the afternoon. Well, instead of a CPO installing yet more chargers, how about installing slightly fewer and add a battery pack? Now, public EV chargers on average have a utilization rate of less than 20%. In other words, 80% of the day that's not being used at all. Obviously, that includes overnight when nobody's there. They're just sat idle. If you could buy your electricity at heavily discounted rates and discount your price per kilowatt hour that you charge, you can now possibly double or treble the utilization rate. People will travel several miles for cheap petrol or cheap EV charging. But just like houses, this is not the ideal scenario. See, we began by talking about domestic solar panels with a battery. So what happens when a public EV charger uses solar or wind power as a generator, then adds a Megapack battery? And this is exactly what Tesla is starting to install over there in the States. Well, why not before now, you may ask, if they're so profitable? Well, the trouble is Tesla make the chargers and they also make the Megapacks, and the worldwide demand for the Megapacks is such that there is simply massive demand. There's about a 2-year waiting list, and they can sell them at incredible profit margins. Some suspect this could be as high as 60 or 80%, which is considerably higher than they would realize by installing them themselves at a supercharger to reduce the cost. Once again, supply and demand. But that's begun to change recently because of how customers are using the Megapacks. Instead of buying cheap electricity and selling it dear to individual EV drivers, they can buy cheap and sell very dear in commercial quantities to and from the grid. They operate as what are known as peaker plants. The grid normally runs with a relatively small number of generators, but at peak demand, it's all hands to the pump and they need far more. Some generators they keep ticking over in the background is called hot standby. It's not used, majority of the day just sits there ticking over, but it can be turned fully on when the demand peaks. In return, the grid pays them a nominal amount to run in standby, but then pays obscenely high rates for their peak electricity when they're turned on full, and sometimes just for a few minutes, or more likely up to about an hour. Peaker plants simply run in standby most of the time and make a fortune when they actually produce electricity. Well, you now have quite an incredible installation. During the 80% of the time no cars are charging, you can be charging your batteries with the wind or the solar, effectively free. If neither can meet the demand, then top up overnight at the cheaper rates from the grid. But when the grid runs short at peak times, sell it back to them at peaker rates, holding back just enough to cover the EV chargers that are likely to be used before the next top-up period for the battery. The software to do this now exists. Tesla writes their own. And they've got a package. One predicts grid supply and demand, so it knows pretty accurately how much electricity you have got to have available to buy and sell, and how much you need for the grid. Another tracks electricity prices, so you can see how much it's worth. Another one tracks how many cars are likely to be charging. Well, a full package offers far more to optimize the total return. Install an oversized battery so there's excess capacity to trade electricity to and from the grid every day as a peaker plant. Store sufficient electricity to run the supercharger most days, topping up only ever at night at cheap rates, and only ever if the PV or wind provides less than optimal. Drop EV charging prices to attract EV drivers? Well, this is a system that suddenly has a list of benefits. First, it places no significant additional load on the grid. For the majority of the operation, it'll be fully autonomous, and on the occasions when the grid is needed, it will be for a very reduced demand for a short period of time, because the solar and or the wind farm are actually producing something. It will generate sufficient income operating as a peaker plant, buy cheap, sell very dear. It will provide a very healthy return, Also, it helps the grid at peak times. Third, it will allow a higher EV charging profit margin at all times, as what will be bought from the grid will always be at the cheapest rate, but most of it will be straight off the solar panels or the wind farm. Fourth, it will allow the reduction in price charged per kilowatt, thus significantly increasing the utilization rate and profits. And fifth, it will allow much quicker and cheaper installations. No more waiting around for the grid connection, which will be smaller and therefore should be cheaper and quicker anyway. As soon as you get enough kit together and install it, you can actually be up and running totally off grid initially. If the installation cannot run at full power, totally off grid all the time, it could probably operate fully off grid at reduced power per bay on those occasions while waiting for the grid connection. Now, if in future the national grid just goes to pot, have my suspicions, no new investments made, demand keeps rising, blackouts begin to become far too regular, a collapse much like what we've seen with the water companies, then these mega chargers will be able to operate effectively off grid most of the time, and they'll still have some excess on other occasions produced by the solar or wind farm to sell back to the struggling grid for a very nice profit. Well, CPOs, the charge point operators, they expand and sometimes even operate largely courtesy of outside investment. CPOs like GridServe, Osprey, Instavolt, they've all received some very hefty investments. These Megapack Superchargers might offer their investors a much more stable return. They might also attract new investors and investments with the promise of higher and much more stable returns. And Tesla's just announced one such project in California, and they certainly don't do things by half. It is a 168 base supercharger with a 1.5 megawatt grid connection plus 11 megawatt of ground-mounted solar PV and 10 megapacks with 39 megawatt hours of storage. The grid connection power is truly tiny when some of the UK locations, like the very much smaller Rugby and Exeter, large to us but smaller to this, require very many times more megawatts. Well, will anyone listen? Well, I'll certainly be telling as many people as I can. Time will tell if anything changes. I'm Dave. Now, if you have enjoyed this, please click the like button. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. It really makes a difference to a small channel like ours. A big thank you to our Patreon members. List of those is in the description. Thank you very much for your support. You do in return get some goodies. We do have meetups. We do have a chat line where I give personal answers. You do see some videos that we don't launch on YouTube and occasional bloopers. So yeah, if that's what you would like to do, if you'd like to support the channel, have a look in the Patreon below. Thanks very much. I'm Dave.